a purple backpack in a pond. The workers assumed someone had left it behind. They opened it, and 3 hours later, the entire investigative team was on the scene. What was inside will become clear as the story unfolds, but the person responsible is more disturbing than the discovery itself. Sunday morning, November 16th, East Moscow, Galyanovsky Pond, a small body of water tucked deep inside a residential district. No embankment, no benches. Reconstruction work was underway. By 1926, the plan was to turn it into a recreational area with a beach and sun loungers. Workers were hauling in cement and preparing the site. Around 9:30 in the morning, one of them noticed the backpack floating in the water with a plastic bag nearby. They pulled both out, looked inside, and called the police. A forensic specialist established a preliminary age of 7 to 10 years. Time since passing, 1 to 3 days. Marks consistent with strangulation were found on the neck, along with bruising, but nothing else was recovered from the water. The pond is shallow. Locals said they could have drained it, but even without that, it was clear. The rest wasn't here. It was somewhere else. There were no cameras near the pond itself. The area was deserted, but investigators pulled footage from the nearest city cameras. On one of them, the night of November 14th, a man of medium build, approximately, approaches the water, throws in the bag, and calmly walks away. At that point, his identity was unknown. As would later become clear, this man was the first link in the chain that would lead investigators to the woman at the center of it all. The investigative committee opened a case. Police began cross-checking all missing persons reports from the previous days. By that same evening, around 5:30, an elderly woman walked into a local precinct and said her grandson was missing. On the surface, everything lined up. The woman explained the disappearance. According to the grandmother, the boy had been taken from home by the mother's live-in partner, some man, and hadn't been brought back. Investigators contacted the mother, Elena, right away. She confirmed, yes, her son had left with her boyfriend. Where to? She didn't know. When he'd be back, she didn't know either. The account matched the grandmother's story perfectly. There was a concrete suspect, and the description fit the man on the cameras. The case moved from __quote_0__ to active search. The Moscow and Moscow Oblast prosecutors' offices took control of the investigation since it formally spanned 2 regions. The discovery had been made in Moscow, while the family lived in the suburbs. But one detail didn't fit. Neighbors at Elena's building in the Novaya Alexeyevskaya Roshcha complex in Balashikha, interviewed that same evening, all said the same thing. None of them had ever seen a man near her. She lived alone with her son and her cats. No partner, no live-in boyfriend. That evening, this inconsistency hadn't yet become the key lead. Police continued searching for the man on the cameras. The real answer would come the following day. That evening, officers drove out to Balashikha, Dmitrieva Street, Zhakhanovaya, Alexeyevskaya Roshcha, 10th floor, a 1-room apartment. Elena opened the door. Inside, scattered belongings, barely any furniture, a mattress on the floor instead of a bed, 4 cats, and a distinct smell. What they had been looking for was found on the balcony. There lay what remained of Elena's 6-year-old son. Beside him were knives. Forensic analysis would later determine that a hacksaw had been used. The head had been severed, wrapped in a bag, placed in the purple backpack, and transported 8 kilometers to Galyanovsky Pond. Everything else was here, on the balcony of a rented 1-room apartment. During the search, knives and other physical evidence were seized. 3 expert examinations were ordered: forensic medical, molecular genetic, and criminalistic. The boyfriend theory was already falling apart. But she couldn't be detained that evening. She was in a state where she couldn't provide coherent testimony. One detail from that evening would be referenced throughout the entire case file. When officers came for her, she didn't ask about her son. She didn't ask about her daughter. She resisted and screamed about only one thing, that her 4 cats would be left without anyone to care for them. The detention was postponed to the following morning. A voluntary confession entered the case record on the morning of November 17th. Elena Tsutskova was detained, brought in for questioning, and she began talking immediately. 31 years old, born in the city of Zarechny, Penza Oblast, mother of two, a 9-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son. She wrote the confession herself and admitted everything. There had been no boyfriend. She had invented him to mislead the investigation. She had inflicted multiple wounds on her son herself. She had done everything herself, and she had personally transported the backpack to the pond. Investigators asked the central question, why? Elena couldn't answer. Not refused. Couldn't. She was unable to identify what had driven her to this. The investigation recorded it formally. Motive not established. The main investigative directorate of the Investigative Committee for Moscow Oblast opened a case under Paragraph B, Part 2, on the grounds that the victim had been in a state of helplessness. The central apparatus of the Investigative Committee took the case under its oversight. A psychological and psychiatric evaluation was ordered to determine whether Elena had understood her actions. If she were found not legally competent, the outcome would not be a prison sentence. It would be compulsory psychiatric treatment. But that same evening, the situation shifted. An attorney came to see her, and after that meeting, she recanted all of her testimony, invoking Article 51 of the Constitution, the right not to testify against oneself. Morning, a full confession. Evening, a full retraction. What happened between those two moments remained behind closed doors. The investigation continued working with what it had. Expert conclusions, neighbor testimony. Elena was remanded to pre-trial detention, and as would later become clear, the central question of this case was not who, but why. Up until this point, all attention had focused on the events of a single night. But to understand them, the story has to go back. Before Moscow, Elena had lived in a small, closed city, a satellite of a defense facility. In 2013, she came to the capital and enrolled at the Moscow State University for the Humanities, studying education. She completed 2 years, dropped out, and stayed. Here she met Alexander Mititsin. They would live together for roughly 10 years, never officially marrying. They had 2 children, a daughter first, then a son, Miroslav. Mititsin's own background was complicated. According to records from the Kursak court in Vladimir Oblast, he had 2 prior convictions. In 2014, theft as part of a group, a cigarette case taken from an unlocked car, an attempted theft of a scooter from a store, a bicycle stolen while intoxicated. Result: 8 months in a penal settlement. There were also references to an illegal weapons charge. He had outstanding debts of no less than 76,000 rubles in enforcement proceedings. In recent years, Elena had worked as a courier, then in retail chain stores, and hadn't stayed anywhere long. Life moved at a steady but low idle. No career, no savings, no real foundation. From the outside, this looked like an ordinary young family. Not the most stable, but not a crisis either. Thousands like it across the Moscow suburbs, and no one who knew them could have imagined how it would end. But inside this family, something had been building that wasn't visible from the outside. Miroslav was born with hydrocephalus, an excess accumulation of fluid in the brain. He could only move in a wheelchair. Complete dependence on his mother every minute of the day, feeding, changing, repositioning, taking him out. No breaks. No days off, no possibility of leaving him alone even for an hour. A family acquaintance named Anastasia, who later helped Elena find the apartment, described him this way. Kind, affectionate, he would reach out to his mother, look at her. He was attached to her the way children are attached when there is simply no other person in their world. This fact would later form the foundation of the charge. The article under which the case was opened specifically referenced the victim's state of helplessness. Elena also had a daughter. She was approaching 10 at the time, in 2nd grade at a school in Balashika, but she wasn't living with her mother. After the parents separated, she had stayed with her father. The paternal grandmother later said the girl had complained about her mother, saying she hit her. Miroslav had stayed with Elena. He had no choice. Summer, 2025. Elena left Mititsin. By all accounts, it was her decision. Miroslav stayed with his mother. Elena responded to an apartment listing, a one-bedroom, 38,000 rubles a month. At move-in, she said she'd be living with 2 children, cats, and a friend. That's how Anastasia met Elena. First impression? Normal. Speech coherent, behavior appropriate, nothing to raise concern. Just a young mother looking for housing after a breakup. The father, by his account, continued helping and tried to visit his son, but Elena increasingly stopped answering his calls. Once, Maititsin came to her door. She didn't open it. The grandmother said Elena's behavior had become erratic, and contact with her was growing more difficult. By this point, the picture was this: alone in a rented one-bedroom apartment with a severely ill son who needed her attention 24 hours a day. The connection with the father was breaking down, no outside support, and yet Elena paid rent without fail, not once late, every month on time, as though that was the last thing she was holding on to: 4 walls and a dress, the appearance of a normal life. By late summer, Anastasia began noticing changes. She'd stop by to check on the apartment at the owner's request. Each time, the picture was roughly the same: empty refrigerator, a pan on the stove with what appeared to be cutlets of uncertain origin, uncleaned litter boxes from 4 cats, a smell throughout the apartment. But Miroslav was clean and dressed. Elena was washing him, changing him, feeding him. Everything else around her was coming apart. Running parallel to this, Elena appeared as a defendant in a series of court cases, all of them filed by microloan organizations, for loans she had taken out and not repaid. Enforcement orders had been issued across the board. 6 active enforcement proceedings in the court enforcement database opened between June 2024 and May 2025. Total amount, approximately 93,000 rubles. Not a large sum on paper, but for someone who couldn't afford proper food, it was a noose. Anastasia mentioned one detail in particular. Elena came to her one day and calmly, openly said that she was using synthetic substances. No justification, no request for help. She simply stated it as a fact and added, "I like it." No shame, no secrecy, as though it was the only thing that still allowed her to feel something other than exhaustion. At this stage, Elena was still holding on. She was caring for her son, answering questions. But the gap between how she appeared on the outside and what was happening within her was growing wider. In conversations with Anastasia, Elena didn't filter herself. She said what she felt directly, without any attempt to present a better image. On one hand, she dreamed of having both children with her. She talked about wanting to bring her daughter home, said her ex-husband wouldn't let her. She resented him for it. On the other hand, in those same conversations, sometimes in the same breath, she admitted something else entirely. "I can't cope. They irritate me. My daughter is always asking for something. I get aggressive toward them a lot." These weren't interpretations. They were nearly verbatim quotes that Anastasia later passed to journalists. Elena wasn't just exhausted. She simultaneously wanted to be a mother, wanted her daughter back, wanted to be present, and couldn't bear the weight of it. Both things existed at once. I want to be with them, and I can't take them. Neither one won. On the program Let Them Talk, a neighbor recounted that Elena had told her she was exhausted, that caring for her son was wearing her down, but she hadn't sought help. When Anastasia suggested she go to court to fight for custody of her daughter, Elena refused. She explained, she was registered with a psychiatrist, and with her diagnosis, going to court would be pointless. She knew about her diagnosis. She knew it closed the door to her daughter. She knew she was harming them. And she knew she wasn't doing anything about it. But at that point, no one around her was alarmed enough to act. The grandmother confirmed that a woman named Yulia had been living with Elena. Her daughter had mentioned that Elena would leave Miroslav in Yulia's care when she went out. Yulia was the only person who had been providing real help, watching Miroslav, connecting with him, effectively filling in for Elena during the hours when Elena was gone or couldn't manage. Not a hired caregiver, not a social worker, just a friend who lived nearby and took on part of the burden. In September 2025, Elena told Yulia to leave. The reason for the conflict is unknown. No source explains what happened between them. Yulia came to Anastasia in tears and said one thing: her friend had thrown her out. They never spoke again. From that moment, Elena was completely alone. Between Yulia's departure and November 14th, 2 months. What happened during that time is almost entirely unknown. Anastasia recalled their last meeting. Elena looked different. Very quiet, hollowed out, no interest in anything. Her answers didn't track with the questions, like someone who hears the words but doesn't register the meaning. That was the last time anyone who knew her saw Elena before her arrest. Alongside the collapse of her everyday life, Elena maintained a parallel existence online. She ran social media pages, writing about walking between worlds and experiments with consciousness. She claimed that for 22 years she had been followed by numbers in her dreams, and she interpreted them as signals from another dimension. She believed she was being guided. She was interested in rituals, ran a Telegram channel where she posted AI-generated images. She frequently changed phone numbers and social media accounts, like someone either hiding or unable to remain in any one reality. She had appeared on a program and spoken openly about her diagnosis, schizophrenia. Elena didn't say it directly, but referenced a difficult past situation that had led to her being placed on a psychiatric registry. She spoke about the occult openly and willingly. From the outside, this could look like another angle: esotericism, rituals, other dimensions, maybe a ritual act, a false trail that seems plausible for a moment, but something else lies behind it. The line between mystical interest and clinical delusion had dissolved. Walking between worlds was not a metaphor, not a game, not a subculture. For someone with paranoid schizophrenia, it can be a literal lived experience, one in which voices, visions, and signs are part of the clinical picture, not an exotic hobby. Psychiatrist Vasily Shurov, commenting on the case for news.ru, put it plainly. Elena had lost herself in mystical thinking, but more precisely, it was the reverse. Mystical thinking had become the language in which her illness expressed itself. Paranoid schizophrenia was not the only diagnosis. Her medical record listed several others: bipolar disorder, epilepsy, depression. Since 2023, she had been prescribed medication for manic episodes, for depression, and for seizure management. A standard protocol for that combination: complex but functional, under one condition, if the patient adheres to it. She took her medications when she could. That's not unusual. People with these diagnoses often discontinue treatment because the medications leave them feeling dulled, disconnected from themselves. But in her case, there was an additional layer. As far back as 2014, a report had been filed against her for evading treatment for substance dependency. 11 years earlier, meaning the issue with substances had predated Miroslav by far. Schizophrenia alone is not a sentence. Around 1% of the global population lives with this diagnosis. Millions of people work, raise families, maintain stability because they are in treatment, because they have support, because the system around them is functioning. Psychiatrist Andrei Antsiborov, commenting on the case for Snob, confirmed, add substances to that equation and the risk multiplies 15 times, and as would later become evident, this specific combination, discontinued medication plus substances, was the key to everything that followed. Elena wasn't simply using substances, and she wasn't simply taking her prescribed medications, she was mixing them. According to Schott, the combination, antipsychotics prescribed for schizophrenia alongside illegal substances, triggered episodes of aggression she could not control. Not irritability, not an outburst, but the kind of aggression after which she likely had no memory of what she had done. The mechanism is specific, and Antsiborov explained it. Antipsychotics suppress dopamine, that is their function. Substances, by contrast, flood the system with it. When both processes run simultaneously, the brain receives contradictory signals, and the regulation system simply breaks down. The result: hallucinations, complete disconnection from reality, and not an emotional breakdown, but clinical psychosis. A state in which a person may be unable to distinguish the living from the lifeless, what belongs to them from what doesn't, what is real from what a voice in their head is commanding. This is where the gap becomes visible between how we want to understand this story and what it actually is. The easy answer is, she was cruel, she was monstrous, but the clinical picture says something different. She was ill, and instead of treatment, she received substances that turned her illness into a detonator. Who supplied her with them is unknown. Whether anyone was monitoring her medication compliance, apparently not. Whether she was under the influence specifically on November 14th, the investigation has not yet established that. But the combination itself had existed for a long time. Those around her had seen it. From the beginning of September 2025, emergency services had been called to Elena's address multiple times. The reason noted in call records: erratic behavior. A crew would arrive, assess the situation, and leave. What happened after each visit is unknown. In Russia, involuntary psychiatric hospitalization requires a court order and must be predicated on an immediate threat. In all likelihood, the formal threshold was never met. Neighbors from her previous apartment told the same story. They frequently saw Elena in a disturbed state. Screaming could be heard from inside her unit. One neighbor heard it regularly and specified it was clearly not an adult screaming. At the new address on Dmitrieva Street, the pattern continued. 3 days before November 14th, at around 11 in the evening, a neighbor heard Elena screaming something out the window. At 4:30 in the morning, the screaming resumed, this time from inside the apartment. Here's what the picture shows. Emergency calls had been made. Screaming had been heard. At the previous address, neighbors had observed marks on both of them, bruises, scars. After the case became public, a government official stated that responsibility should lie with the psychiatrist overseeing Tsutskova's treatment. But the question turned out to be more complex than one responsible physician, because the physician was only one link. There were many links. November 12, 2025, 4 days before the workers pulled the backpack from the pond, a separate incident occurred elsewhere in Moscow. A child was harmed, and the perpetrator subsequently attempted to end their own life. The story spread quickly across social media, was picked up by Telegram channels and news feeds. According to Shot, Elena may have seen that coverage, and for someone in her state, with active delusions, with voices, with the belief that she was moving between worlds, another person's story could have registered not as information, but as a signal. In psychiatry, this is known as induced delusion, when a persistent idea held by one person is transmitted to another who is already in a vulnerable state. Not suggestion, not imitation, but the experience of another's action as confirmation of one's own internal voices. The parallel is striking. Same city, same age, 6 years old, same month. Proving a connection between the two incidents is impossible. The investigation doesn't claim one, but dismissing the coincidence is equally difficult, especially given everything that had already converged by that point. Illness without treatment, substances layered over medication, complete isolation, 2 months alone with the child she could no longer carry. If all of this was a powder keg, the news of November 12th may have been the match, or it may not have been. We will most likely never know. But 2 days after it, Elena picked up a knife. According to the charges, on November 14th, Elena Tsutskova, while inside the apartment in Balashikha, took a household knife and inflicted multiple penetrating wounds on Miroslav, to the chest, abdomen, upper and lower limbs. He could not walk. He could not speak. He could not shield himself, move away, or call out. He could only look at her the way he always had, reaching his hand toward her. Afterward, she used a hacksaw, likely in an attempt to redirect the investigation. According to multiple sources, Elena then attempted to take her own life, and fresh wounds were found on her body afterward. According to sources, what stopped her was not thoughts of her daughter, not fear, not remorse. She stopped because she was afraid there would be no one left to feed her 4 cats. The cats, the only thing that held her on this side. Not the son who was no longer there, not the daughter living with her father. The cats. This is not cruelty. This is not cynicism. In all likelihood, this is the point where the illness had completely replaced reality, where the connection to people no longer existed, but the connection to animals still held, like the last wire that hadn't burned through. 2 days remained until the morning of November 16th, when the workers pulled the backpack from the water. Elena spent them in the apartment and with what remained on the balcony, with her cats. Alone. After Elena's detention, the investigative committee opened a separate proceeding into negligence by Child Protective Services. According to investigators, authorities should have moved to terminate her parental rights. There were documented grounds: harm to the children, substance dependency, but the agency had not acted. Why? The answer wasn't found in anyone's malicious intent. It was found in how the system itself is built. Under Russian law, medical institutions are not required to report a patient's diagnosis to Child Protective Services. Doctor-patient confidentiality. A physician who knows that a woman with paranoid schizophrenia is raising a severely disabled child alone says nothing because they are legally required to say nothing. The police also knew. Emergency calls had been made, neighbor complaints had been logged, screaming had been documented, but each time, the formal threshold wasn't met or wasn't looked for. Child Protective Services didn't know because no one had told them. Every link in the chain was operating by its own rules. The doctor kept the secret. The police waited for formal grounds. Child Services never received the signal. The neighbors didn't consider it their business. The father didn't push hard enough. And not one of these links, on its own, looks monstrous. Yet Miroslav moved toward what happened on November 14th without a single chance to be redirected. The Balashikha court remanded Elena to pretrial detention. She faces up to 20 years. Life imprisonment is not imposed on women in Russia. Legal expert Kaminsky believes she will most likely be found legally competent. She invented the boyfriend. She transported the backpack. She gave false testimony. That sequence indicates she understood what she was doing. But what remains after the verdict, whatever it turns out to be, is a question about a chain of people who each knew something and none of whom did enough. How many more apartments are there, with screaming behind the wall, with a smell coming from under the door, with someone inside that no one is checking on? There is no answer to that question, and that, perhaps, is the most frightening thing of all.